I should have listened to the way the birds went dead silent when I crossed the creek bed at Devil's Elbow. You grow up in these mountains, and you learn that the woods have a heartbeat. But that day, the heart had stopped. I was scouting a new perimeter for the timber company, pushing deeper into the thickets of the Blue Ridge than any sane man ought to. The fog didn't just roll in, it crawled. It was thick, smelling of wet slate and something copper, like old pennies and fresh blood. That's when I saw the first one. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was a structure made of bleached deer ribs and woven hemlock branches, standing 6 feet tall in the middle of a clearing that wasn't on any of my maps. It looked like a rib cage, an empty, waiting chest. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Then the chanting started. It wasn't loud. It was a low, rhythmic vibration that I felt in my molars before I heard it with my ears. He who watches, he who never sleeps, the soil is thirsty. I crouched behind a rotted oak, my breath hitching in my chest. Down in the basin of the hollow, 50 people, maybe more, were kneeling in a perfect circle. They weren't wearing robes like you see in the movies. They were wearing Sunday best, overalls, floral print dresses, work boots, but their heads were covered in hoods made from the raw, cured hides of black bears. In the center of the circle stood a man holding a rusted iron spike and a heavy mallet. He wasn't looking at the sky. He was looking straight into a hole in the earth that seemed to swallow the very light around it. He raised the mallet, and the chanting reached a fever pitch, a guttural screaming sound that tore through the trees, just as the mallet swung down toward the spike, toward whatever was screaming inside that hole. I felt a cold, calloused hand clamp firmly over my mouth. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just a pair of yellow, unblinking eyes staring at me from the knot of a tree trunk that hadn't been there a second ago. A voice whispered directly into my brain, cold as a winter grave. "You're late for the harvest, brother." Voice profile. Suggestion: increase intensity. Slower pace at first, building to a frantic, trembling finish. Part 2, The Roots of the Family Tree. The hand didn't let go. It felt like dry bark scraping against my skin, pulling me backward into the shadows of the hemlocks. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat as the yellow eyes in the tree blinked. The wood itself seemed to ripple, and a man stepped out from the trunk, his skin the color of wet clay, and his eyes glowing with a sickly, rhythmic light. He didn't look at me with hate. He looked at me with pity. He leaned in, his breath smelling of disturbed earth, and whispered, "Don't fight the mountain, Caleb. It's got a long memory, and it's been calling your name since the day you were born." I kicked. I clawed. I managed to break free and bolted toward the clearing, thinking, God help me, that the people in the hoods might be more human than the thing in the tree. I tumbled down the embankment, sliding through the briars until I landed at the very edge of the circle. The chanting stopped instantly. Silence in the Appalachians is never just silence. It's a physical weight. The man with the mallet turned slowly. The bear hide hood shifted, and as he stepped into the light of the torches, I saw his hands. They were covered in the same birthmarks as mine. Exactly the same. He reached up and pulled back the hood. It wasn't some demon or a stranger. It was my father. My father, who we'd buried in a closed casket 3 years ago. after he went missing in these very woods. He looked at me, his eyes hollowed out and weeping a black, oily fluid, and he smiled. "We've been keeping the seat warm for you, son," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. He stepped aside, pointing the iron spike toward that bottomless hole in the dirt. "The mountain doesn't want a stranger. It wants the blood it already knows. It wants the one who ran away." I backed away, shaking my head, my boots treading on something soft. I looked down. The ground wasn't made of dirt. It was made of clothes. Hundreds of years of clothes. Calico dresses, denim jackets, modern hiking gear, all rotting into the soil. I realized then that the cult wasn't a group of neighbors. It was my entire lineage. Every ancestor who had ever disappeared in these hills was standing there, watching me with those same yellow eyes. My father grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice, and forced me to look down into the pit. I expected to see fire. I expected to see teeth. But as the mallet rose one last time, the torchlight hit the bottom of the hole, and I saw myself. Not a reflection, not a twin. I saw my own corpse, rotted, ancient, and dressed in clothes from a century ago, staring back at me with a grin. I wasn't the visitor. I was the thing they had been trying to bury for 100 years. And tonight, they were finally letting me out. That concludes the story. Would you like me to write a different variation of the twist? Or perhaps a prequel, explaining how the first Caleb ended up in that hole? They tell you, when you're hiking the deep ridges of the Monongahela, never to follow the sound of a crying child. They say it's just a panther, or the wind playing tricks through the limestone caves. But they don't tell you about the singing. They don't tell you about the high, thin harmony that sounds like a dozen flutes made of human bone. I was 3 days into the backcountry when I heard it. It wasn't a melody, it was a vibration, a shimmering sound that made the water in my canteen ripple. I followed it, not because I wanted to, but because my feet felt like they were being pulled by magnets buried deep in the Appalachian mud. I crested a ridge that looked like the spine of a starved dog, and there, nestled in a hollow that shouldn't have existed, was the town of Oakhaven. It wasn't a town, it was a wound. 20 gray windowless cabins circled a massive dead white oak. The ground was scorched black, and the air tasted like pennies and burnt hair. Then they emerged. Not from the houses, but from the earth. Crawling out of crawl spaces and cellar doors. They weren't wearing robes. They were draped in heavy, wet quilts. Thick, handmade things that looked like they were soaked in old grease. Their faces were obscured by masks of dried corn husks, stitched together with what looked like copper wire. I tried to run, but my shadow wouldn't move. I looked down at the dirt, and my heart nearly stopped. My shadow, my own damn shadow, was pinned to the ground by a rusted railroad spike. And standing over it was a man. He was 7 feet tall, his body wrapped in those same greasy quilts, holding a leather-bound book that seemed to be pulsing, like it had a heart beating inside the cover. He didn't speak. He just pointed a long, yellowed fingernail at me, and the congregation began to hum. It wasn't a song anymore. It was a command. My shadow began to peel away from the dirt, standing up on its own, its dark fingers reaching for my throat. I backed away, tripping over a tree root, and as I fell, I saw the man in the quilts lean down. He whispered a name. My name. Not the name on my driver's license. but the name my mother only used when I was a baby. "The mountain has been hungry since the last frost, Elias," he rasped, the corn husks of his mask fluttering with every word. "And you brought us such a beautiful, heavy soul to feed it." I felt a coldness start at my toes and move upward, a numbness that felt like my very blood was turning into river silt. Just as the shadow's hands closed around my neck, the ground beneath the great white oak began to split open, and something pale, something with too many limbs, began to climb out. Voice profile. Suggestion. Rapid fire. Panicked. Then shifting into a hollow, rhythmic, soul-crushed monotone. Part 2. The Weaver of the Red Quilt. The thing that crawled out of the earth, it didn't have a face. Not yet. It was a mass of pale, translucent flesh, shimmering like a slug's belly, pulsing with the same rhythm as the mountain's heart. It moved with a sickening, wet sound, like heavy boots pulling out of deep, sucking mud. My shadow wasn't trying to choke me. No, it was anchoring me. It was a tether, pulling the very light out of my eyes and weaving it into that pulp of a creature. The congregation didn't move. They stood like statues, their corn husk masks rustling in a wind that didn't exist. The man in the quilts stepped closer, his heavy, greasy layers scraping against the dead grass. He didn't use the mallet. He didn't use the book. He simply reached out a hand, his fingers long and twisted like the roots of the white oak, and touched my forehead. The cold. Oh, God. It wasn't just cold. It was ancient. It was the feeling of 1,000 Appalachian winters compressed into a single second. My memories began to leak out of me like water from a cracked jar. I saw my mother. I saw the hike. I saw the life I lived. And then they began to turn gray. They began to fade into a history that didn't belong to me anymore. I looked at the creature in the pit, and I saw its skin starting to knit together. It was forming features, a nose, a mouth, a chin. It was forming my face. I tried to scream, but the sound that came out wasn't human. It was that high, thin harmony of the bone flutes. I looked down at my hands and I watched, paralyzed, as they turned yellow. My skin began to dry out, becoming brittle and papery, like a husk. The greasy quilts on the man standing over me didn't look like fabric anymore. I realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated horror what they really were. They were layers, hundreds of layers of dried, tanned human skin, stitched together with copper wire. The man in the quilts finally leaned down and pulled back his mask. Underneath there was no face, just a hollow, dark cavity lined with rows of needle-thin teeth. He didn't want to kill me. He didn't want to eat me. He whispered, his voice vibrating inside my own skull. "The cycle is hungry, Elias. The mountain needs a new coat." The creature, the new Elias, stood up from the pit. It wiped the grave dirt from its fresh, perfect face and looked at me with my own eyes. It smiled, a bright, vibrant smile that I hadn't used in years. It turned and began to walk back toward the trail, heading toward my car, my home, my life, and I couldn't even weep. I felt the first stitch of copper wire pierce my lip as the congregation gathered around me with their needles. I wasn't the sacrifice. I was the replacement. And the man in the quilts? He wasn't a priest. He was the Elias who came before me. And he was finally allowed to die. There's a part of the Deep Smokies, way back past where the logging roads turn to silt and prayer, that the locals call the Throat. It's a place where the geography doesn't make sense. The maps say it's a valley, but when you're in it, it feels like the inside of a rib cage. I was a surveyor for the state back in '98, tasked with marking the boundaries of a forgotten land grant. I'd spent my whole life in these mountains, and I thought I knew their language. I thought I knew how the wind sounds when it's just the wind, and how it sounds when it's something else. I was wrong. I'd been trekking for 6 hours when the silence hit. Not a normal quiet, but a total, suffocating vacuum. The birds didn't just stop singing, it felt like they'd never existed at all. Then, I smelled it. A cloying, heavy scent that sat on the back of my tongue. It smelled like wild honey, mixed with the rot of a dead stag. I pushed through a thicket of rhododendrons so dense they felt like fingers clawing at my pack. And that's when I saw the chapel of the Iron Root. It wasn't built of stone or timber, it was woven. Huge black vines, thick as a man's thigh, had been coaxed and grafted together to form a spire that pierced the canopy like a needle. There were no windows, only thousands of tiny, hand-carved holes in the wood that whistled as the pressure changed. And there, standing in the clearing, were the parishioners. There were dozens of them, standing perfectly still in the knee-high ferns. They weren't wearing hoods or masks. They were altered. Their skin had been etched with intricate, swirling patterns, not tattoos, but deep, raised scars that looked like the bark of a hemlock tree. They were barefoot, their toes elongated and digging into the soft earth like actual roots. In the center of them stood a woman, the Mother of the Grove. She was tall, impossibly thin, and her hair wasn't hair at all. It was a crown of living, flowering briars that had grown directly into her scalp. I should have run then. I should have dropped my gear and bolted back toward the ridge. But I couldn't move. My boots felt heavy, anchored. The mother turned toward me, and her eyes, they didn't have pupils. They were just solid, milky white orbs, like cataracts or polished marble. She didn't speak with words. She opened her mouth, and a sound came out. A low, grinding drone that mimicked the sound of a tree snapping in a storm. One by one, the parishioners began to turn. They didn't walk. They shifted, their joints popping and cracking with the sound of dry kindling. They began to encircle me, their scarred faces twitching in a rhythmic, terrifying unison. The mother reached into the hollow of the iron root spire and pulled out a long, jagged needle made of black glass and a spool of what looked like raw, red nerves. She began to walk toward me, the briars in her head weeping a thick amber sap. "The map is incomplete, child," she whispered, and her voice didn't come from her mouth. It came from the trees behind me. "You've spent your life measuring the skin of the world, but tonight, we're going to show you the bone." I tried to scream, but as I opened my mouth, a vine, thin and cold as a snake, shot out from the dirt beneath my feet and surged into my throat, choking the sound into a wet, gurgling sob. The mother raised the black needle, and as she brought it down toward my chest, I saw the patterns on her own skin start to move, shifting and crawling like 1,000 insects under the surface. The needle didn't pierce my skin. It drank it. The moment that black glass touched my sternum, the world didn't go dark. It went bright. Too bright. I felt the red thread, those raw, pulsing nerves, begin to slide under my collarbone, weaving through my ribs like a spider sewing a web in a basement. The vine in my throat thickened, tasting of bitter sap and ancient cold rainwater. I couldn't breathe, but I didn't die. That was the horror of it. My heart kept beating, but it wasn't pumping blood anymore. It was pumping that thick amber resin I'd seen weeping from the mother's crown. Around me, the parishioners began to sway. Their joints didn't just pop. They snapped and reformed, their limbs lengthening, their skin turning the color of weathered oak. I watched as the man closest to me, a man wearing the tattered remains of a 1940s park ranger uniform, simply sat down in the dirt. I watched his fingers elongate, turning into pale, questing roots that pushed through the soil with a wet, tearing sound. He wasn't dying. He was planting. The mother leaned over me, her white orbs reflecting nothing but the swaying black spire of the iron root. "You think you came here to measure the land, Elias," she whispered, her voice now 1,000 rustling leaves inside my own ears. "But the land has been measuring you since the first step you took on the trail." The pain was a distant secondary thing compared to the expansion. That's the only word for it. My mind began to stretch. I could feel the movement of worms 3 miles away. I could feel the weight of a hawk landing on a branch on the next ridge over. I felt the slow, tectonic hunger of the mountains themselves, a deep, lithic consciousness that viewed human lives like the morning dew, here for a second, then gone. The mother pushed the needle through my palm, pinning my hand to the floor of the grove, and as the red thread cinched tight, I saw the patterns on my skin finally settle. They weren't just scars. They were topographical lines. My left arm was the drainage of the French Broad River. My chest was the jagged peaks of the great craggy mountains. "The map!" I tried to gasp, the vine in my throat vibrating with the effort. "The land grant. It was a lie." The mother smiled, showing teeth that were nothing more than jagged chips of flint. "No, Elias, it was an invitation. Every surveyor we've taken, every explorer who thought they could own these ridges, they all become part of the record. You aren't marking the boundary anymore. You are the boundary." I looked at the black spire of the iron root, and the holes in the wood began to whistle a new tune. It was my voice, my own scream captured in the wood, being played back by the wind. I felt my legs go numb as they merged with the heavy black silt of the hollow. I was becoming wood. I was becoming stone. But right as the transformation reached my neck, right as the amber sap began to seal my eyes shut, I saw the truth. I looked at the mother's face, really looked at it, and I saw the wedding ring hanging on a chain of briars around her neck. It was my mother's ring, the one she was buried with 20 years ago. And then I looked at the parishioners again. I didn't just see strangers. I saw the faces from the old black and white photos in our family album. My uncles, my grandfathers, the lost cousins. They weren't a cult. They were my blood. But here's the twist. The thing that makes me want to scream through the bark that's now my skin. As my vision finally faded into the green-black of the forest, I realized why I had been sent here. My company didn't send me. The state didn't send me. I had sent myself. I looked down at the map I'd been carrying in my pocket, the one I'd been drawing for weeks. It wasn't a map of the Smokies. It was a diagram of a cage. And as the last of my humanity withered away, I felt a new set of memories flood in. I wasn't the first Elias. I wasn't even the 10th. I am the same soul, reborn again and again, sent out into the world just long enough to grow a fresh heart, only to be called back home to feed the root. I've been the mother. I've been the ranger. I've been the tree. And as the sun sets over the throat, I feel a familiar weight in my hand. The vine in my throat retreats, and I look down to see my fingers have turned into a long, jagged needle of black glass. I hear a branch snap at the edge of the clearing. A young man pushes through the rhododendrons, a surveyor's transit in his hand, and my own name on his brass name tag. He looks at me with terror. I open my mouth to warn him, but all that comes out is the high, thin whistle of the wind through the holes in my chest. I raise the needle. I can't help it. The mountain is hungry, and it's time to sew another stitch into the family tree. Folks in North Carolina talk about the Brown Mountain Lights like they're some kind of tourist attraction. A campfire story to tell while you're sipping moonshine and looking out over the Linville Gorge. They call them ghost hunters or swamp gas. But those of us who grew up in the shadow of that cursed ridge, we know the lights don't just sit there to be looked at. They're scouts. They're the flickering eyes of something that hasn't had a name since the Cherokee first warned people to stay away from the Mountain of the Smoking Spirits. It was a Tuesday in late October when I went up there. I wasn't looking for ghosts. I was looking for my brother, Silas. He'd gone up 3 nights prior with a camera and a tripod, obsessed with proving the lights were just some atmospheric anomaly. When he didn't come back, and the local sheriff gave me that look, that hollow, "Don't ask me to go up there" look, I knew I was on my own. I hiked past the marked trails, past the danger steep terrain signs, until the trees started to look wrong. The oaks were twisted into shapes that looked like they were trying to crawl out of the soil, and the silence was so thick it made my ears ring with a high, mournful pitch. Just as the sun dipped behind the jagged teeth of the gorge, the first light appeared. It wasn't a spark. It wasn't a flame. It was a globe of sickly, pulsating violet that drifted out from behind a granite outcropping. It didn't flicker like a lantern. It throbbed like a heartbeat. And then another one appeared. Blue, then a deep, bruised orange. They were hovering 10 feet off the ground, moving with a terrifying, intelligent grace. They weren't just floating. They were searching. I ducked behind a massive boulder, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The lights began to converge on a flat, rocky plateau about 50 yards ahead of me. And then the sound started. It wasn't a roar or a scream. It was a humming. Thousands of voices vibrating at once. A harmonic frequency that made the very marrow in my bones feel like it was melting. From the darkness beneath the plateau, figures began to emerge. They didn't walk out of the woods. They seemed to rise directly out of the stone, their bodies shimmering with the same iridescent light as the orbs. They were dressed in rags that spanned centuries, colonial buckskins, Civil War grays, 1970s hiking gear, all of them bleached white as bone. They moved in a perfect synchronized circle, their heads tilted back, eyes wide and glowing with that same violet fire. In the center of the circle, I saw him, Silas. He was standing on a stone altar that looked like it had been fused together by extreme heat. He wasn't tied down. He was suspended. The violet light was pouring out of his mouth and nostrils, connecting him to the orbs above like a glowing umbilical cord. I tried to shout his name, but the air in my lungs turned to ice. One of the figures, a man in a tattered Union uniform, stopped his rotation. He didn't have a face. Where his features should have been, there was only a swirling, chaotic vortex of orange sparks. He raised a hand and pointed directly at the boulder where I was hiding. The humming stopped instantly. The violet light in Silas's eyes flared into a blinding sun, and a voice, not Silas's, but a choir of 1,000 dead things, boomed inside my skull. "The vessel is full! Bring us the witness!" Voice profile. Suggestion: voice should be trembling, becoming more rhythmic and hypnotic toward the end. Deep breaths between paragraphs. Slower, more deliberate pacing. Part 2. The Loom of the Violet Fire. The moment that voice hit me, the witness, the world didn't just go silent, it went dead. The air lost its weight. I tried to scramble back to claw my way into the rhododendrons, but the ground beneath me felt like it was turning into liquid glass. Those figures, the ones in the rags of 100 different years, they didn't run. They glided. Their movements were jerky, like a film skipping frames, a strobe light nightmare that made my eyes ache. As they closed the distance, I saw their faces clearly for the first time. They were wrong. It was that feeling, that uncanny valley crawl, that makes your skin want to leave your bones. Their eyes were too wide. Their mouths were stitched into permanent, upside-down grins. And when they blinked, their eyelids moved from the sides like a reptile. It was the Thatcher effect come to life. A mockery of a human face that looked like it had been put together by something that had only ever heard of people in a bad dream. I was dragged toward the plateau by an invisible force, a magnetic pull that felt like it was tugging on the iron in my very blood. I passed the Union soldier, and as I did, he leaned in. He didn't have a voice box. He just moved his jaw, and the sound of 1,000 dry cicadas filled my head. "Look at the light, witness," he clicked. "See the history they forgot to write in the books." I was forced onto my knees at the base of the altar. Up close, Silas looked hollow. His skin was translucent, stretched over his ribs like wet parchment. The violet light wasn't just coming out of him, it was weaving him. It was a loom made of pure radioactive energy, and Silas was the thread. He looked down at me, his eyes glowing with that terrifying ancient fire, and for a split second, the fire died down. He mouthed one word, a word that chilled me more than the mountain air. He didn't say help. He said, "Again." The man in the vortex, the leader, stepped onto the altar. He reached into the column of violet light and pulled out a handful of what looked like glowing, liquid mercury. He held it over me, and the congregation began to hum a new frequency, a low, guttural vibration that felt like a drill against my skull. "The mountain isn't a tomb," the leader rasped, the sparks in his face swirling in a frantic orange dance. "It's a battery. We are the keepers of the pulse, and the pulse requires a fresh memory to keep the lights burning. We don't take the body, Elias. We take the narrative." He tilted his hand, and the liquid light began to drip onto my forehead. It didn't burn. It was cold. It was the cold of deep space, the cold of the bottom of the ocean, the cold of a god named Valata, who had been sleeping under Brown Mountain since the stars were young. My memories started to detach. I felt the birth of my first child, the smell of the pines in the morning, the sound of Silas laughing when we were 10. I felt them being ripped out of my mind and fed into the violet pillar. I watched as the light turned from violet to a deep, bloody crimson. Silas, the thing that looked like Silas, began to solidify. His skin turned healthy. His eyes became brown again. He stepped off the altar, breathing deeply, looking at his hands like they were a miracle. He looked at me, but he didn't see his brother. He saw a spent battery. He leaned down, his face a perfect, beautiful mask of humanity, and whispered, "Thank you for the trade, Elias. It was your turn to carry the spark." And here is the twist that makes the mountain scream. As the last of my memories were sucked into the orb, I didn't die. I didn't disappear. I looked down at my hands and saw them turning into that shimmering, iridescent bone white. I looked at the man who was Silas as he picked up the camera and the tripod, walking back down the trail toward the world of the living. I tried to call out to him, but the only sound I could make was that high, thin, rhythmic humming. I looked at the Union soldier and I realized I knew him. He wasn't a stranger. He was the man who had come looking for me 40 years ago. And the man I called Silas, he wasn't my brother. He was the witness from the cycle before. They'll tell you it started with a dog or a bird, but they weren't there in the winter of 1817. I was. My name is John Bell Jr., and I'm telling you now, before the ink on this page turns to dust, that what came for my family wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a witch. It was a hunger that had been waiting in the limestone caves of the Red River since the earth was cooling, and my father, God help him, was the one who woke it up. It began in the cornrows, a black dog with the head of a rabbit, just sitting there, staring at Pa with eyes that looked like boiling tar. He shot at it, but the bullets didn't thud into meat. They just vanished into the air. That night, the scratching started. It wasn't outside the house. It was inside the walls. Not a mouse, not a rat, but the sound of human fingernails dragging slowly against the cedar planks, over and over, from the floorboards to the ceiling. Then came the voices. At first, it was just a whisper, a wet whistling sound that mimicked the wind in the chimney. But within a week, it knew our names. It knew our sins. It would sit in the corner of the dark kitchen and recite the Bible back to us, but it would reverse the verses, turning the gospel into something that smelled of sulfur and wet earth. It called itself Kate. It claimed it was a neighbor we'd cheated. But the voice was wrong. It was too many people at once. It was a choir of the damned speaking through a single, invisible throat. The physical toll was the worst. My sister Betsy, she was the focus of its affection. We would be sitting at the dinner table, the candles flickering in a wind that wasn't there, and suddenly, crack. Her head would snap back, a red handprint blooming on her cheek as if she'd been slapped by a giant. Her hair would be pulled toward the ceiling by invisible fingers until she was screaming, dangled like a marionette in the middle of the parlor. Pa tried to fight it. He was a hard man, a man who'd carved a kingdom out of the Tennessee wilderness. But this thing, it didn't want his land. It wanted his breath. It began to affect his tongue. He'd try to speak and his jaw would lock shut, his tongue swelling until he was choking on his own spit. The entity would laugh, a high, shrill sound like glass breaking, and whisper, "Not yet, John. I haven't finished the recipe yet. It's been 3 years now. The house is a hollow shell. We've had generals and preachers and skeptics come to the door, and all of them leave white-haired and trembling. But last night was different. The witch didn't scream. It didn't slap Betsy. It just sat at the foot of my bed, and for the first time, I didn't hear a ghost. I heard myself. It spoke with my voice perfectly, and it told me exactly where the poison was hidden. I looked under the floorboards, and there it was, a small black vial that didn't belong to any of us. I went to show my father, but as I reached for the door to his room, the house went dead silent. The scratching stopped. The wind stopped. And through the heavy oak door, I heard my father weeping. But he wasn't weeping in pain. He was apologizing to something that wasn't there. I turned the handle. The door shouldn't have been locked, but it was. And from the other side, that voice, my voice, whispered, "Don't go in there, brother. You won't like the face he's wearing tonight." Voice profile suggestion. A shivering, breathy whisper that gradually builds into a frantic, heart-pounding confession. Use long, heavy pauses at the ellipses. Part 2. The Harvest of the Bell. I stood at that door for what felt like an eternity. The wood was cold, vibrating under my palm like a living heart. The voice, my voice, was still laughing behind the oak planks, a wet rhythmic sound that didn't belong in a human throat. I kicked the door, once, twice. On the third strike, the lock didn't just break, it shattered like ice. The room was filled with a thick gray vapor that tasted like old copper and chimney soot. My father, John Bell Sr., was slumped in his high-backed chair, but he wasn't sitting. He was pinned. His arms were stretched out, his fingers clawing at the air, as if he were trying to pull himself out of his own skin. And standing over him was it. It wasn't a woman. It wasn't Kate. It was a shape made of shifting, oily shadows, its face constantly flickering like a flame in a draft. One second it was my sister Betsy. The next it was an old woman I'd seen in a dream. And then it settled. It settled on a face that was almost human but wrong. The eyes were placed just an inch too wide. The nose was a sharp, jagged ridge of bone, and when it smiled it had too many teeth, all of them needle-thin and translucent. It was a mockery of a person, a creature that had crawled out of the uncanny valley of our own nightmares. "Look at him, John," the entity hissed, its voice now a dissonant chord of 100 different townspeople. "Look at the king of the Red River, drowning in the very dirt he stole." I raised the black vial I'd found under the floorboards. "Leave him!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "Take the poison and go back to the caves." The entity stopped. It turned its head, not a tilt, but a full 180-degree rotation, until it was staring at me while its body remained fixed on my father. It let out a sound that wasn't a laugh. It was a subatomic hum that made the windows rattle in their frames. It glided toward me, its feet never touching the floorboards. As it stepped into the moonlight, the Thatcher effect took hold of its features. Its eyes seemed to flip upside down within its skull, creating a hideous, distorted mask that made my stomach turn. "The vial isn't for me, little Belle," it whispered, leaning so close I could smell the scent of ancient wet limestone. "The vial is the invitation. Your father didn't cheat a neighbor. He didn't anger a witch. He dug too deep. He broke the seal of the Ancient One, the one who waited before the sun was bright. He wanted the land to be rich, and the land asked for a price in blood. I watched in horror as the entity reached out a long, spindly finger and touched the black vial. The glass didn't break. It absorbed into the creature's skin. My father let out a final rattling breath, his eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. He slumped forward, dead, before he hit the rug. I fell to my knees, sobbing, waiting for the shadow to take me next. I expected teeth. I expected the cold. But the entity didn't strike. It began to shrink. It began to pull itself inward, the shadows knitting together, the distorted face smoothing out until it was an exact, perfect mirror of my own. It stood there, looking down at me with my eyes, wearing my clothes, breathing with my lungs. "Why?" I gasped. The room spinning. "Why kill him now? Why torment us for years?" The mirror thing smiled, a soft, terrifyingly human smile. Torment? No, John. We were cultivating. A soul doesn't taste right when it's happy. It has to be seasoned with fear, aged in the dark, marinated in the tears of a family. Broken. We didn't want his life. We wanted his legacy. The creature turned and walked toward the window, looking out over the dark Tennessee hills. "The Bell Witch is a story for the neighbors," it said, its voice now identical to mine in every cadence. "But the truth is, the harvest. I am the part of you that survives. I am the shadow that walks into the light while you stay here, in the dark, in the walls, in the scratching." I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't move. I looked down at my hands and saw them turning into that same shifting, oily smoke. I looked at the floorboards and saw my own fingernails starting to dig into the wood, carving my name over and over again. The man who looked like me stepped out of the window and onto the grass, walking toward the stables with a whistle on his lips, heading toward my life, my future, my Betsy. And as the sun began to rise over the Red River, I realized the final, sickening twist. The Bell Witch was never a ghost haunting our house. I was the Bell Witch. I was the manifestation of every dark thought my father ever had. A psychic tumor grown from his greed. And now that he was dead, the tumor had become the man, and the man had become the ghost. I began to scratch. I couldn't help it. The wood was so soft, and I was so hungry. The floorboards beneath my feet didn't just creak. They groaned, like the house itself was trying to warn me to get out, while I still had the breath to do so. That whistle. It was identical. It had that same flat, off-key sharp on the final note that Silas always hit. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My muscles felt like they'd been turned to cold lead. Every instinct I had was screaming that if I looked at whatever was standing at the top of those cellar stairs, the trap would finally snap shut. I kept my eyes fixed on the thing outside, the thing wearing my brother's face like a discarded mask. Its jaw dropped open, further than a human jaw should ever go, and it started to let out a wet, clicking sound. Clack, 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 like dry bones hitting the porch floor. Behind me, the cellar door, the one I knew I'd bolted after dinner, swung open the rest of the way with the slow, agonizing whine of rusted hinges. The whistling stopped. In its place came a voice. It wasn't Silas's voice. It was mine. It sounded exactly like me. Same gravelly tone, same Appalachian drawl, whispering from the dark of the hallway. It said, "Don't be afraid, Eli. We're just here to bring you back to the scene. The coal needs a witness." I felt a hand, long, spindly, and unnaturally cold, press against the back of my neck. The skin felt like damp earth. I bolted. I didn't think, I just lunged forward, bursting through the screen door and slamming right into the thing on the porch. It didn't feel like hitting a man. It felt like hitting a bundle of dry sticks wrapped in leather. We tumbled off the porch and into the dirt, and for a second, I was face to face with it. Up close, it didn't have features. The face I saw from the window was just a trick of the light and shadow, a suggestion of a person. It was just a blank, pale membrane, with holes where the breath should come out. It didn't smell like death. It smelled like ozone and deep, ancient rain. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the tree line, my boots skidding on the damp grass. I didn't head for the road. The road is where they find you. I headed for the old Whispering Mine entrance, the one that collapsed back in '94. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could lose them in the rocks. But as I reached the mouth of the cave, I stopped dead. The fog wasn't just rolling out of the hollow anymore, it was glowing. A faint, sickly green light was pulsing from deep inside the earth. And the sound, God, the sound was deafening. It was thousands of voices, all of them whistling that same mournful tune, overlapping until it sounded like a choir of the damned. I turned back to look at my house, perched on the hill like a lonely grave. The lights were all on now. I could see two figures standing on the porch, side by side. One looked like Silas. One looked like me. They weren't chasing me anymore. They were just waving. A slow, synchronized goodbye. That's when I realized the ground beneath my feet wasn't solid. The moss I was standing on was moving. It was hair. Coarse, gray hair, growing right out of the mountain. The whole ridge breathed in a massive, heaving expansion of the earth. And I felt myself starting to sink. The mountains aren't just rock and timber, Eli. They're hungry. And they've been waiting a long, long time for someone to finally listen. The hair, it was like wire, wrapping around my ankles, pulling me down into the soft black loam that smelled of ancient rot and wet copper. I thrashed, clawing at the dirt, but the ridge wasn't dirt anymore, it was skin. The whole mountain was a sleeping thing, and I was nothing more than a parasite. It was finally decided to swallow. I looked back at the house, my house, and the lights were blinding now. The two figures, the thing that looked like Silas and the thing that looked like me, they stepped off the porch in perfect unison. They didn't walk. They glided over the grass, their limbs twitching with that same sickening, disjointed hitch. As I sank deeper, the moss rose up to my chest, pinning my arms to my sides. The green light from the mine's mouth spilled out, thick as syrup, coating the trees until they looked like skeletal fingers reaching for a dying sky. The whistling from the cave intensified. It wasn't just a tune anymore. It was a vibration that rattled my teeth and made my vision blur. I tried to scream, but the air in my lungs felt heavy, like I was inhaling silt. The me creature reached the edge of the sinkhole first. It knelt down, its face still that blank, pale membrane. But then, right before my eyes, the skin began to ripple. Features started to push through from the inside. My nose, the scar on my chin, the exact shape of my weathered lips. It was stealing me. Not just my life, but my very being. It leaned close, and I could feel the cold radiating off its skin. It whispered, but the voice didn't come from its mouth. It echoed inside my own skull. Don't fight the seam, Eli. Every stone in this ridge was once a man who thought he was free. Now, you're just the next layer of the history. The thing reached out and gently closed my eyes with fingers that felt like damp limestone. I felt the mountain give one final, massive heave, a deep, subterranean sigh, and the ground opened up completely. I fell, not into a cave, but into a sea of cold, crushing dark, where 1,000 voices were still whistling that same sharp note. The last thing I felt was the weight of the Appalachian earth settling over me, miles and miles of it, pressing me into the coal. Up above on the ridge, the lights in the house flickered once and stayed steady. A man who looked like me walked back inside, sat in my chair, and picked up my coffee. He looked out the window at the silent, foggy woods. And he smiled, because out here in the hills, nothing ever really stays buried. It just waits for its turn to walk. The sound. It wasn't the metallic click of a brass zipper like you'd find on a coat. No, it was wetter. It was the sound of something organic being forced apart, like the sound of a dry husk being peeled off a ripened ear of corn, but layered with the sickening rhythmic tear of muscle fibers. Zip, zip, zip. Each pull seemed to vibrate through the very air, rattling the marrow in my bones. I stood there, knee-deep in the freezing creek water, my flashlight beam shaking so hard it looked like a strobe light against the dark current. The figure in the floral dress didn't move her feet, but her shoulders began to hunch forward, the fabric of the dress straining until the seams at the armpits began to pop with the sound of small caliber gunshots. The woods behind me had gone beyond quiet. They felt dead. It was as if every living thing within 5 miles had pulled its head into its shell and was holding its collective breath, waiting for the mountain to finish what it had started. The smell of those funeral lilies grew so thick I could almost taste it, a cloying, sugary rot that coated the back of my throat. I tried to back away to pull my boots from the sucking mud of the creek bed, but my legs felt like they'd been rooted into the silt. I was part of the landscape now, a witness to something the old-timers only whispered about over dying embers. The zipper sound reached the base of her spine, and that's when the dress started to sag. It didn't fall off. It started to fold inward, as if the person inside was shrinking, or perhaps uncoiling. The head, still tilted at that impossible, neck-breaking angle, began to rotate. Not the way a human neck turns, but a slow, grinding revolution, like a heavy stone being dragged over gravel. I watched, paralyzed, as the back of the mom creature split wide open. A pale, glistening line of something that looked like raw, wet porcelain began to emerge from the rift in the skin. It wasn't a spine. It was a series of long, needle-thin ribs that began to unfurl like the legs of a spider waking up from a long sleep. The floral fabric of the dress didn't tear. It was being absorbed, the colors bleeding into the white mass that was pushing its way out of the mother-shaped shell. Then, the voice came again. But it didn't come from the figure in the water. It came from the trees directly above my head. A dozen different voices all at once. All of them sounding like her. All of them whispering the same 3 words in a perfect, terrifying harmony. Is it me? I looked up, and for a split second, my flashlight caught the glint of 1,000 tiny, unblinking eyes reflected in the branches, just as the thing in the water finally turned completely around to show me what was hiding behind my mother's face. The thing in the water, it didn't have a face. Not really. When it finally turned around, I saw that the skin where my mother's kind, wrinkled features should have been was as smooth as a river stone, except for a single jagged vertical slit that ran from the hairline down to where the throat started. As the light hit it, that slit peeled back like a set of wet, gray eyelids, revealing a row of teeth, not human teeth, but tiny, needle-sharp shards of flint, all vibrating in a frantic, humming motion. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel it looking at me, studying the shape of my fear like it was a map it was learning to read. Then, those 1,000 voices in the branches above let out a collective, sharp intake of breath. The pale porcelain ribs I'd seen emerging from its back suddenly snapped outward, spanning 10 feet across the creek, and the mom creature didn't walk. It launched. It moved with a speed that the human eye isn't meant to track, a blurring streak of white and floral print that hit me with the force of a fallen landslide. I was slammed backward into the freezing mud, the wind driven from my lungs in a desperate, silent wheeze. The weight of it was immense, cold as a tombstone, and smelling of deep, forgotten caves. I felt those spindly, porcelain limbs pinning my wrists into the silt, and the gray slit in its head opened wider, hovering just inches from my own face. The humming of the flint teeth grew louder, a high-pitched drone that made my nose start to bleed. And then, the most terrifying thing happened. The creature's smooth, featureless head began to melt. The gray skin started to swirl and shift, taking on the color of my own tan, the shape of my own nose, the exact 3-day stubble on my jaw. It wasn't just mimicking me anymore. It was stealing me, atom by atom, right there in the dark of the high lonesome. I tried to fight, to scream, to kick, but my body felt like it was being turned to lead. My memories, Sunday dinners, the smell of Grandpap's pipe tobacco, the way the light looks hitting the ridges in autumn, they were being pulled out of my head like threads from a sweater. I watched through my fading vision as the creature's face became a perfect mirror image of mine. It even blinked the same way I did. It leaned in close, its new lips, my lips, curling into a slow, practiced smile. The voices in the trees went silent. The porcelain ribs folded back into the creature's spine with a series of wet, muffled clicks. It stood up, letting my limp, empty body sink further into the creek's embrace. It reached down, picked up my fallen flashlight, and brushed the mud off the floral Sunday dress, which was now nothing more than a scrap of gray skin it tucked away into its own side. I watched, paralyzed and hollow, as the thing that looked exactly like Caleb turned and started walking back up the switchback trail toward the cabin. It walked with my gait, my posture, even the slight limp in my left knee. As it reached the edge of the porch light, it stopped, looked back toward the dark creek one last time, and let out a long, satisfied sigh in my mother's voice. "Don't you worry now, Caleb," it whispered into the wind. "I'll take real good care of the house." Then it stepped inside, clicked the lock, and turned out the lights, leaving me alone in the water. Just another sound for the next poor soul to hear calling from the deep laurel thickets. There's a place deep in the 13-mile holler where the maps just give up. The locals call it the Salt Eater's Well. It's an old stone structure tucked behind a grove of weeping hemlocks that look like they're trying to hide the damn thing from the sun. My granddaddy, a man who feared nothing but the Lord and a dry harvest, told me never to go near it. He said that back in the Great Depression, the well didn't run out of water. It ran out of mercy. He told me that when the wind blows from the north, if you listen close enough, you can hear a bell ringing from deep inside the earth. Not a church bell, mind you, but a small silver dinner bell. The kind my grandmother used to call us home with. I should have listened. But curiosity in the Appalachians is a dangerous, hungry thing. Last night the moon was just a sliver of bone in the sky, and that bell, it started. Ting, ting, ting. It was rhythmic, insistent, coming from the direction of the hemlocks. I grabbed my granddaddy's old iron fire poker and a heavy-duty lantern, and I started walking. The air got colder with every step, the kind of cold that crawls under your skin and settles in your joints. When I reached the clearing, the hemlocks were dead silent, their branches draped in a thick, unnatural frost. The well sat there, its stones blackened as if by fire, and the wooden crank was turning, all by itself. Creak, creak, creak. The rope was taut, disappearing down into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight. I leaned over the edge, the smell of old copper and wet salt hitting me like a physical blow. I lowered my lantern into the shaft, the light flickering against the slimy, moss-covered walls. About 30 feet down, the light caught on something. Something that wasn't stone. It was a hand. A pale, slender hand, perfectly preserved, reaching out from a crack in the masonry. It was holding a small silver bell, but as I watched, the fingers didn't just ring the bell. They started to grow. The skin bubbled and stretched, the knuckles popping like dry kindling, until the arm was 10 feet long, snaking its way up the side of the well toward me. I tried to pull back, but my feet were frozen to the frost-covered stones. The arm kept coming, moving with a fluid, liquid grace that no human limb should possess. And then, from the depths of that black hole, a face began to rise. It wasn't my grandmother's face, but it was wearing her Sunday hat, the one with the silk roses. As the face broke the line of the lantern light, I saw that it had no eyes, just two perfectly round, polished mirrors where the sockets should be. In the reflection of those mirrors, I didn't see myself standing at the top of the well. I saw myself already at the bottom, looking up. The hand, that long, white, tapering thing, clamped onto the mossy rim of the well with a sound like a wet boot pulling out of the mud. Its fingers were like cold, wet wax, and as they tightened on the stone, I felt a sharp, stinging heat in my own fingertips. I tried to scream, I tried to beg, but my throat was suddenly full of grit. It was salt, coarse, biting salt that sucked every drop of moisture from my tongue until it felt like a piece of dried leather in my mouth. I watched, paralyzed, as the creature hauled its torso out of the dark. It didn't have bones, not like we do. Its body moved like a heavy curtain in a draft, shifting and folding in ways that made my stomach turn. The Sunday hat it wore was pristine, the silk roses looking as fresh as if they'd just been plucked from a garden. But the face beneath it was a void. Those mirror eyes, those terrible polished circles, they were getting closer. I looked into them again, and the me at the bottom of the well was screaming now. I could see the bubbles of my own breath rising in the black water in the reflection. I could feel the cold pressure of the deep stone walls closing in around my ribs. Even though I was still standing on the grass, the creature reached out its other hand, the one not holding the bell, and it touched my cheek. Its skin was crystalline, rough and abrasive, like a block of salt that had been sitting in the rain. "The well is thirsty, Silas," it whispered. The voice didn't come from the creature. It came from the silver bell. The metal itself was vibrating, ringing out the words in a high melodic chime that shattered the silence of the holler. And the mountain always takes its grain. As its fingers brushed my skin, I felt my own weight begin to evaporate. My memories, my granddaddy's face, the smell of the hemlocks, the heat of the wood stove, they weren't mine anymore. They were being pulled through that touch, flowing like a river into the creature's hollow frame. I looked down at my hands and saw them turning pale, turning translucent, turning into salt. The world began to tilt. The trees, the sky, the flickering lantern, they all started to recede, becoming nothing more than a small, circular pinprick of light far, far above. I felt the splash of freezing, briny water against my back. I wasn't on the ridge anymore. I was at the bottom, looking up through 30 feet of suffocating dark. I watched from the depths as the creature, the thing that was now wearing my face, my clothes, and my very soul, leaned over the edge of the well. It looked down at me with my own eyes, adjusted Granddaddy's fire poker in its grip, and let out a long, slow breath of satisfaction. It reached up and took off the Sunday hat, tossing it down into the shaft. The silk roses fluttered through the air like dying birds before hitting the water next to my head. Then, with a strength I never knew I had, it grabbed the heavy stone lid of the well and began to slide it into place. The silver bell gave one final, mocking ting, and then the stone slammed shut. The last thing I heard was the sound of my own boots crunching through the frost, walking away toward the cabin, leaving me to wait in the salt and the dark for the next curious soul to hear the bell